Welcome to our free LSAT prep hour for August 26, 2019. We are going to talk about logical reasoning, and the theme for today is what is the issue? Basically, we're going to get into what is the author even talking about? How do they make that point? And then when we see a case where there's a disagreement or we're trying to strengthen weaken, how do we apply that information? So that's what we're doing today. Check us out online if you want to check out any of our resources, if you want to sign up for our class, and stick around to ask me questions at the end if you have questions about any of that, but I'm going to toss you right in. So one of the first things we're going to do anytime we're dealing with a logical reasoning argument is we want to make sure we understand what the author's point is, where the actual conclusion is. And one of the standard types we'll see is a question that flat out asks you to express the main conclusion of the argument. Now, this could seem very, very easy, right? Because in a lot of arguments, they'll say, A causes B and B causes C, therefore A causes C, or something like that. They're going to really have it clearly labeled at the end, right? But of course, when they're asking you for the main point, they're not going to give you one like that, because who would miss it, right? They're going to give you an argument that's a little harder to analyze. So I want to give you a minute to think about this argument and where we're going to find the main conclusion and why. So first, just take a moment to read it if you haven't seen this one before. And then we're going to discuss. So spend a moment with it. Okay, so looking at this, let's think of this in terms of simple line numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which line or lines would the author's conclusion be on, do you think? Go ahead and chat that in. Which line or lines contain the author's conclusion? Okay, seeing a lot of agreement. 2, 2, and 1. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so a lot of people are centering around 2, and then it's a question of how much of this constitutes a conclusion. So if I read lines 1, 2, and 3, I'd see, hey, some people claim this. However, there's little evidence to support this belief since the study's testing, blah, 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 is due to, okay. So we've got a some claim, we've got a however, and we've got a since. And so it's really useful to notice these kind of keywords that drive the action. Got this, we've got this, this. And later on, we have another, does anyone see another signal elsewhere in the passage? What signal do we have? After all. What does after all indicate? Think about how you'd say after all in speech. What does after all signal to us? We're going out to dinner and I say, well, you should pay for the wine. After all, you drank all of it, right? And it's saying it's a premise. Yeah, right. It's got to be supporting what I'm saying. You should drink the wine. You should drink the wine. You should pay for the wine is what I think. Why do I think so? You're the one who drank it. You should pay for the wine. After all, you drank it. So after all is a premise indicator. So we know that this is a support for the author's point. This is a premise. This is not the main point. And no one said that it was. Okay. So then it's a matter of what are the other parts. So a really common structure you'll see on the LSAT, not just in logical reasoning, but in reading comp as well, you'll see some claim. And as soon as you say some claim, what can you expect? We could expect, well, it's definitely a claim, fair enough. Yeah, it's definitely a claim, but we can expect a disagreement, right? We can expect that there isn't a pivot yet, but we can expect that there will be one, right? Um, Imagine if you were reading a story and it started with, some people are born into lives of privilege, everything comes easily to them, and they're given everything they wanted, and life seems laid out like a stretch of, easily openable doors, right? Well, there's two possibilities of how they're going to run with this. Either they're going to say, and that's not me, that wasn't my life was hard. Or they'll say, that's how I was until one day, right? What they're probably not going to write as a story is, some people's lives seem easy and everything's laid out and great for them, and this is a story about someone whose life was like that. That sounds boring. You don't write those stories. And so when I say some claim, I could say, hey, some people claim this and they're right, and that's that. But if that's the case, then why would I bother to credit them? Why wouldn't I just say that's what's true, right? So you can generally expect, and I mean, you don't have to take it on faith. You'll see the support for it later, but you can generally expect that this is going to be an opposing point, opposing view that will be countered. And that's pretty much guaranteed to be true. If it's not true, if you're surprised, if later on they say, so that claim is correct, then fine, then it was correct. But I can't think of an example of that, right? And I can think of many examples where they say, hey, everyone thinks this and they're wrong, here's why. That's probably, I don't know if I want to say it's the single most common structure for an idea conclusion, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were. So we see this opposing view, and then, I saw a prediction of there'll be a pivot. Well, there it is. However, anytime you see however, there's some kind of pivot. Now, what kind of pivot? Where are we going? That's another story. But there's always some kind of difference. Okay? Now, what does since indicate? We already saw that after all indicates a premise. I marked it here, but I'll show that it's a premise indicator. What does since indicate? It's another premise indicator. And that one can be used more than one direction, right? I can say, well, I wrote since over since. That's very helpful. Let's try that again. Premise. So I can read that more than one way. I could say, since you broke the cup, you should buy it. Or you should buy the cup since you broke it. The order actually doesn't make any difference. It's just like when we see if-thens, right? When we see conditional statements, I might say, if it rains, it's cloudy. Or if it's cloudy, right? Sorry, I should say that wrong. It's cloudy if it rains, right? Those mean the same thing. They both mean if rain, then cloudy. And so these both mean premise, broke, conclusion, buy. So since can be done either way, but in this case, since the since comes after a statement, that tells us that this part in the middle is a conclusion. So if anyone had any trouble finding the conclusion, we've got a since coming after it. Now, sometimes you'll see a more complicated argument that has since that has a since statement and a conclusion, and then it has some larger conclusion. So they could say something like, there's little evidence to support this since blah, 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 and therefore this other thing. And you'll see some of those. If you want to have some fun with exercise of this, you can get our giant 5-pound book of practice drills where we've built out long, annoying things with multiple counter arguments and things like that built in them to give you practice on this. But that's the idea. So we know that piece, that there's little evidence to support this belief, is a conclusion. So a couple things to keep aware of on a question of this type. One is general principle. They like to hide the conclusion in the middle. And so so it's the conclusion tends to hide in the middle on ID, the conclusion questions. On other questions, it's safe to hang out at the end because it's not trying to hide, right? When they're just giving you a really difficult, like ID the flaw question, then they could say, hey, this is true, and this is true, and this is true, therefore this other thing is true. what's the flaw? What's wrong with the argument? And then your job is something different. You're not worried about where the conclusion is, usually. That can be an extra level of challenge. But you're concerned about what the flaw is. Here, since the only challenge is to find the conclusion, they have to hide it. So where can they hide it? It's pretty obvious at the end. It's often pretty obvious at the beginning. If I say something like, you should vote for me. After all, I'm the best candidate and everyone else is terrible, blah, blah, blah. Okay, then you can see it. So putting it in the middle is a little tricky. The other trick that they have, but it's not only so tricky because we can get used to it and predict it. The other common trick that they use is that the conclusion will often use what we call borrowed language. So what do we mean by that? They didn't spell out the conclusion. They didn't say, you should vote for me. They said, there's little evidence to support this belief. If you hadn't read the rest, you'd have no idea what the conclusion was, right? Little evidence to support what belief? So what belief are they talking about? Whether migratory birds, the claim that people had, right? This thing. I could highlight the whole thing that allows them to blah, 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 blah. This whole thing is the belief. So the structure you can expect over and over again is of the form, some people think this, but they're wrong. Here's why. That's the general structure we have here. So it's a common structure. I'm going to put it here so you can still see it when we're looking at the answer choices. Some people think X, that think something, but they're wrong. Here's why. The here's why might have its own conclusion. It might say this is happening and therefore that. They could have done that. They could have said the bird studies did this and this and are therefore inconclusive. And that would be another way to trick you, because you could see therefore inconclusive and say, well, that's the main point. But therefore inconclusive would still be supporting the bigger point that therefore we shouldn't believe this thing. So the structure is some people think X, but they're wrong is the conclusion, and here's why. And so then we just have to make sure that our answer is going to match that language. So let's try it out with answer choices. And I'm going to give you a little poll. So you'll be able to choose your answer. You'll have to click an answer, and then I think there's a button to share that answer right in the poll. So try polling in, and let's see how you do. All right, if you're not sure, give us your best guess. Seeing a lot of folks answering. All right, so careful if you grabbed, there's a couple things to watch out for. I'm seeing a couple of people focus on trap answers. So we want something that says they're wrong, that there isn't evidence to support, like that migratory birds, we don't know they have a homing sense. So watch out for a couple of things. So no one's picking D because they didn't specifically focus on the ability to use landmarks. In fact, they've said they may simply navigate using landmarks, in which case they don't have an innate sense, right? And they're not saying about whether it's false to say humans have. One thing that's good is we can avoid the distraction about humans if we realize that's not the point. The beautiful thing about an ID the conclusion question, unlike say a strength and weaken question or assumption question, is that we don't have to really get into the logic. I don't even care about the part about humans. I barely have to read it. As long as I recognize that it's supporting the main point, then I don't care what it says, which is kind of nice. So they're not saying this claim is as false as that. They're simply saying, I don't believe this. Here's, well, why? Because the patterns are inconclusive. Maybe this is just happening. And we don't say that humans have a false sense of direction, but that doesn't mean they're equally false. Maybe it's more likely birds do than humans do. I don't know about that. The point is they don't say it. We're not trying to infer something or decide something. We're just trying to see what they said, and they didn't say this. They have to have said this directly. Now, if we look at A, B, and C, C says studies are inconclusive. So what did we label C as? C was definitely there, but what did we label C as? What was the part about the inconclusive studies? Yeah, we said that was a premise already. So that can't be the conclusion because we've labeled it as a premise. It's outside of our box. So it leaves us with A and B. Notice one really good way to quickly get rid of A is that it mentions humans again. And the point is not about humans, even though they are mentioned in the argument. The conclusion does not mention humans or say anything about humans at all. But let's say we took this out for a second. What if it just said migratory birds do not have an innate homing sense? What would be wrong with this? Yeah, it's too strong. They never said that it's not true. They just said we don't have enough evidence, right? There's a big difference between, for instance, saying I don't have enough evidence to convict this person of this crime versus they're innocent. That's a jump up. Or maybe you don't agree with someone else's religious views and you say, oh, I don't think there's evidence to support your views. But do you say your religion is false? I mean, maybe, right? But whoa, that's another level of certainty that the author isn't professing to have. The author isn't saying, hey, your views are false, even though I kind of said, but they're wrong is kind of the structure. And so that's partly my fault in oversimplifying, right? But notice we have to be careful because sometimes we will oversimplify in that way because that is the general like common structure, but we have to watch the nuance. In this case, they didn't say they're absolutely wrong. They said, we don't have reason to say this. And so the author still could say these people are wrong in that it's wrong to claim this, but not because it's necessarily not true. We just don't know it. So for instance, if I say, Fred committed the crime, I could say it's wrong to say that because we don't have the evidence. That doesn't mean necessarily Fred didn't commit the crime. I'm just saying we don't know. So the author is being a little more humble, which they often will. They'll often be cautious, but it depends. Some authors will say it's very certain. They'll say it can't be the case. This is certainly not so. And then we can go with a more extreme version. But I think another reason to get rid of A, even if you didn't catch that difference between my kind of brute force, but they're wrong summary and the real thing that said there's little evidence, is that the conclusion isn't about humans at all. So generally speaking, the answer in an ID, the conclusion needs to be either exact text that they said or a fair summary of the exact text that they said, right? So in this case, we have to fill in pieces. There's little evidence to support what belief? Oh, the belief that this. So that's B is a fair rephrase of that, right? There is there is not currently evidence or reason to accept the premise or the counterpoint that we saw in the first sentence. Okay. Very good. Yeah, and that's another good way to look at A, that not only is A certain, but it doesn't mention the presence or absence of evidence. It's just jumping onto what is true versus what do we have support for, right? You might, for instance, say that there's not much evidence to believe something, but you think it's true anyway. You're allowed to do that, right? You can think what you want. And so we have to watch the difference between what someone thinks is true or not true versus what they say there's evidence for, and those aren't quite the same. So one thing that's really important when I, call this, this session, what is the issue? It's kind of this idea of what are we even trying to figure out? What is the author arguing about? Is the author arguing about whether the studies are inconclusive? No, they're saying that they are. Are they arguing about human sense of direction? No, they're granting that we don't say humans have an innate sense of direction, right? Maybe you don't think that's true, but for our purposes, we're not worried about that. We're saying that's what the author thinks that we all agree on. And their point is that therefore we shouldn't accept this belief yet. We shouldn't say there's evidence for this belief yet, even though it may turn out to be true. Okay, so watch for what they really say and use those structural signposts, the pivots, the supporting phrases, some people will have lists to memorize or flashcards, and you can certainly do that. But a lot of these phrases, if you stop and use them in a simpler sentence or think about how they're used, you'll often recognize them. But these are some common ones. The some people think, really common sign of, hey, that's someone else's view. However is a pivot. We don't know how that's going to go. That could, I could say, hey, I think you should vote for me. However, some people say that you shouldn't, but they're wrong, and here's why. I could have multiple pivots, right? The however can introduce someone else's view, but it's pretty common that however will be used to introduce the author's opinion or support for the author's opinion. So I might say, for instance, some people think the stock market's going to go down. However, there are several key indicators they're overlooking. Therefore, we can't be sure the stock market will go down. So the however there is introducing new evidence, but not the conclusion itself. It can also show up in a totally different way. For instance, a discrepancy question where we're saying, here's what we expected to happen, however, here's what actually happened. And then your job isn't to identify the conclusion or strengthen or weaken the conclusion, but just to help understand why that happened. And that can happen too. Okay, questions on this one before we move on? Okay. So I want to go on to a different question type. So this is a role question or describe the function question. Basically what we're saying here is, what is this piece of the argument doing? So before we were looking for a particular piece of the argument, hey, what's the conclusion? Now they're going to give us a piece of the argument and say, what is this? It could be the conclusion, it could be a premise, it could be something else. So one thing that's tricky, not everyone does this, but I think it's very important to read the question first so you know what you're talking about. However, on a determine the function type question, sometimes the question is kind of hard to read. Look, if you haven't read this, how confusing this can get. Which one of the following most accurately describes how the statement that most people are taught to be cautious observers of language functions in the cartographer language? What? Oh yeah, I'll come back to that question in just a moment. What are we talking about here? That's really confusing. So I might just have to say, hey, let me recognize the kind of question they're asking. Which one of the following most accurately describes how the statement functions? So if we can recognize that, we can say, hey, this is a determine the function, or what we might call a role question. We're just going to find, our job is to find that part that they're talking about. I might not really know what that means yet because I haven't read the argument, but I'm going to find that part and say, how does it fit in? So I need to do like before, where's the conclusion? So my questions are, where's the conclusion? And how does the, tagged, I could call it, statement fit in? Okay, so take a moment and see if you can do some prediction here. All right, so which part of this is the conclusion? So before we worry about the answer to the question they asked, which part of this is the conclusion? Seeing some work in the chat, see what else people think. Love to get a few takes on this. The part after the however, or the part around the however, I guess we should say. Right? Now, if we look at the part that says they can be manipulated, maps are like languages. They can be manipulated. But notice it says That most people are not generally misled by words, however, should not lead us to think that most people are not susceptible to being misled by maps. So they're saying most people were not fooled by words. That's a surprise to me. I think a lot of people are misled by words, but okay. The author seems to think that's not common. And so notice that they have a should, and anytime you have a should, anytime you see what we call normative language, a recommendation, what you should do, it always sounds like an opinion. And notice that in one way, this is like the last one, where they try to hide the opinion by the main point by putting it in the middle and making it negative. Hey, this other thing isn't true. So the conclusion here is actually that most people are not misled by words should not lead us to think that most people are not susceptible to being misled by maps. Now, what, right? What does that mean? They're saying, one way you can think about it is that there's almost like a counter premise, right? Sure, we don't generally get misled by words. And then in the conclusion, they're saying, but we shouldn't think that means we won't be misled by maps. It'd be kind of like if I said, hey, just because you did well in reading in school, don't think you'll necessarily do well in reading on the LSAT. It's harder, that kind of thing, right? So they're saying that people don't tend to get fooled by words, but don't let that make you think that people aren't susceptible to being misled by maps. But notice even here, I'm kind of using borrowed language in my summary. I'm saying, hey, that is this whole thing. Okay. And why does the author think that we may actually be misled by maps? Why does the author think that we shouldn't be so quick to say we won't be misled? Because in both cases, maps and language, they can be manipulated, right? The folks in the north put themselves on the top of the map, right? And everyone in the south is like, hey, who says you're on top, right? That's a manipulation in itself. Every single map shows the north on top of the south, right? Who says that's really true? Why can't we just have it the other way? So they can both be manipulated. Why does the author think this is different? There's a difference in education, right? So they're saying, hey, most people are taught to be cautious interpreters of language, but education in maps is almost non-existent, right? So we can add that part as an additional premise, basically saying, so we could label this as a premise. Here we don't get misled by words, or you could almost call it a counter premise, like an opposing point. And then the real premise is we are taught to be careful about language, but not with maps. Okay. So they're asking, so if they were asking about the entire sentence, we'd say it's premise. Simple enough, supports the argument. But they're only asking about one half of it. They're only asking about the part about language. So what is that doing in our argument? What is just this first half of the pink sentence doing? How would you describe that? Because they sometimes get a little nerdy in how they describe these in the answer choices. Okay, so it's a concession. That's one way to see it. It's like they're giving something up. They're saying, yeah, that's true, but anyone see it differently? Counter premise to a premise. But notice that it doesn't, that almost, what you guys are saying, concession and counter premise, almost makes it sound like it goes against the author's point. And I think this part goes against the author's point in the sense of, hey, we don't get misled here, so why should we be misled there? But it actually helps the author's point to say that we're taught to be cautious interpreters, because look what's different with maps. So these actually work together, right? These actually work together. And I could say that with anything. I could say, hey, just because most people are able to successfully learn to read doesn't mean that most people can successfully do calculus. And I might say, after all, we have huge areas of our brain dedicated to language, and we don't have huge areas of our brain dedicated to math, that language is an evolved skill and math is not, or something like that. And that could be, both of those might support the same point, that you should expect a difference between language and calculus, right? Yeah, so be careful, right? Notice what they're asking about. They're asking about, and that's why it's always important to check back, because we won't remember it from reading it the first time by the time we do all this. So we want to go back. The statement that most people are taught to be cautious interpreters of language. So what I'll actually do is, I'm going to erase this part just so we can see it. In theory, you could highlight this stuff on the test. I usually wouldn't, but you could. They're asking about the pink part, right? So it's a presupposition, it's a principle, but it's also, notice it's really supporting the author's point. It still is a premise, right? It's part of a premise, right? And it's part of a premise that's telling us what? How is the author's argument proceeding? It tells us, in a sense, to expect a different result, right? Hey, people with training all learn to read. So with training, will everyone learn calculus? Someone might say, no, there could be a different result. Or, hey, people don't get misled by words. Will that happen with maps? No, we should expect a different result, because the people have training not to, not to get fooled by words, and we don't have that training for maps. So can we agree that it's supporting the author's point, and it's supporting the point by saying, hey, language and maps have a different degree of preparation that we're given. Yeah. So we want something that says that. Let's see what happens with some answers. And again, I'll let you pull this in. So here's your poll. All right. Seems some good results. So one thing to watch out for, if I do, it can be really helpful to make a first pass through and get rid of the cases I like the least, and then narrow down. So if I look along and I say, it is offered as an analogical case. I don't know what that is. Let's see. It is a conclusion. No, it's not a conclusion. We already know where the conclusion is. It's part of a distinction, maybe. It is offered as support, maybe. It is the conclusion. So to me, the first ones I would get rid of would be B and E, because it isn't a or the conclusion. It's just supporting their conclusion. Now, what do they mean by it's an analogical case? It's an analogy? Remember that analogy is where you say this is like that. Oh, it would be like if you were going on a trip and you didn't pack enough clothes, or something like that. This is not an analogy. They're talking about the actual things. The argument is about maps and language, and the premise is about maps and language. They're not using maps as an analogy for language or anything like that. So it's not an analogy. So both C and D are talking about supporting. C says it's part of a distinction that supports the argument's conclusion, so it calls it a premise, basically. And D says it's offered a support, but then it said it's offered a support for what? The contention that maps have certain relevant similarities, opposite, right? They're not talking about similarities of maps and language, they're talking about a difference. And so the big distinction we can make between C and D is C is stressing a difference, D is talking about saying that they think they're similar. And they're not arguing that they're similar, they're actually arguing that we shouldn't see them the same way. Okay. How do we feel about that? That one work? Okay, excellent. Yet another type. So here's a procedure question, and this is a broader thing. So we went from what's the conclusion to, hey, how does this part relate to the conclusion? Now we're going to get to what's the whole thing? And this is going to be a little harder to predict an answer for because we don't know exactly how the answer is going to be written. But we're trying to understand why the author thinks what they think. So this gets a little closer to, it's certainly not the assumption family because we're not looking for what's wrong with the argument, but we're looking for why, what is actually going on in the argument? How does the author get from premise to conclusion? That's a little trickier. So let's look at this. It's the question stem is simple. It just says the argument proceeds by. And then I'll flash the answers at you for a moment, and then we're going to come back to them. Reasoning that because of this, drawing a conclusion, taking for granted this, inferring that this, making a prediction. So we're trying to figure out, are they predicting something? Are they successfully inferring something from something else? Are they making some kind of assumption? Are they being contradictory? So they're partly asking, is the author doing something bad, or are they doing something okay? Or maybe neutral, something we're not sure yet without more information whether it's right or wrong. And then what kind of argument are they making? What kind of reasoning are they using? So this is the kind that's a little harder to predict because the answer choice is not, it's not open-ended, but we don't know quite what they want, right? It'd be like if I said, what kind of movie is Star Wars? And you say, well, what do you mean? It could be, I saw people debating whether it's really a science fiction movie or more of a fantasy movie. Or do they mean just a popular movie or an action movie or, an American movie? Like, what do they mean? What kind of movie? Well, it's an inspiring movie that caused me to be a better, no, I don't know what you want me to say, right? And so that can be a little more open-ended. Just cross out the one that's not. Is it a realistic Italian political thriller? No, it's not that. Right? So, maybe we just have to go by process of elimination. So take a moment to read this interesting argument, and then we'll talk. All right, how do we feel about this argument? Does this make any sense to you? Anyone feeling just like, this is weird? Does this, yeah, it's pretty tricky, right? Let's try to play this out. It's weird, but I've seen people use this kind of reasoning very seriously. I've seen people use this reasoning actually to argue that it's very likely that you and I are all part of a computer program. We'll come back to that in a minute. Other people have said that reasoning is not good, but there are some people who still believe that. So let's look at what this is talking about. it says, given the human tendency to explore and colonize new areas, some people believe, now we see some people believe, hold on, that sounds like what we saw before of, these people are going to be wrong. And this argument isn't going to disappoint. They're eventually going to say that these people are wrong, and we can expect that, right? So since people like to explore, some people think that we're eventually going to colonize the galaxy. Humans will spread across the stars, right? That's what they're saying some people think. So we want to notice that trigger. And then they say, look what they do. They say, if so. So now they're trying to draw a conclusion from that, not their own personal conclusion, but just what would follow from that. So if we spread out to many, many galaxies, right? If here's Earth with our, about what we have, like 7 billion people. And if we travel out all to the distant stars, right? Oh, isn't it pretty? I'm just having fun, honestly. This is just therapy for me, right? Double star. Okay. And if we spread out to have trillions of people, most people who ever live will be alive during that time because there's so many people. Does that part make sense? Right? In the Stone Age, there weren't that many humans, right? Now there are billions. And if there are eventually are people all over the galaxy, there are going to be trillions and trillions of people. And so most of the humans in history will be from that period. Are we on board with that? Give me a yes or a smiley or something if that makes sense. Okay, so they're trying to use a statistical argument. They're setting up a statistical argument. So they're saying if that's true, then that's when most people will be alive. And they're like, well, we're humans right now. And we don't think that, this is the weird part, we don't think we're unrepresentative. We think we're normal humans. So why are we special? So why wouldn't we be alive during this time? This is where a lot of us are going to get lost, right? They're basically saying, if we go to the stars, there will be tons of us, right? And in that case, most people will live in that time. Most people, all right, but we don't live in that time. Okay, so I get between the stars here. Since we're probably not special, that's where you might lose me. I'm like, wait, I like being special. That time will probably not happen. It's a little weird, right? But I've seen people use this to say we're probably in a computer program, because they said, look, if eventually some advanced intelligence is able to make worlds within a computer, that there can be many such worlds. And so statistically, most intellects will be inside one of those worlds. So we're probably in one. Weird, right? But that's what they're saying. They're saying, hey, well, live and alive, I could see that. Well, live and alive, they are kind of the same thing. If you live during a period, you're alive during that period. It's more, notice that we're not actually concerned with telling the author that they're wrong. We're just wanting to know what they're saying. We don't have to worry so much about whether they're right, even if we don't necessarily agree with that. I don't necessarily agree with this. I mean, you could just as well say, tell a 5-year-old, well, if you live to be old, you'll spend most of your life as an adult, and you're not an adult now. So what are the chances of that? You're probably never going to live to adulthood. That'd be a really mean thing to tell a 5-year-old, right? It's probably not true. Maybe that is a special time of their life. They're 5. It's special, right? So maybe we're in a special time before we spread to the stars, and we are unusual. Maybe we are in the early days. But I've seen people use a statistical argument to say, they basically said, the chances that we're in the last 5% or the last 10% of, say, the existence of humans would only, would I say the last 5% of the first 5% are only 10%. So we're probably somewhere in the middle. So if you take how long we've been around, we can do the math and see how long humans will be around. It's a stretch. But again, if you're sitting there going, I didn't want to take a statistics class or a exobiology class, I didn't want to study the stars, you don't have to get too deep into this. You can basically just say, what kind of argument are they making? So basically we can say, what they're saying is, since this, since we're not special, and this isn't happening now, this isn't happening to us, it probably won't happen to others, right? It probably won't happen. You don't have to love it to see that's basically what they're saying. Questions about this argument before you worry about answer choices. I want to make sure we're getting the rough idea of it, even if we think it's a little crazy. And if you think it's crazy, you've got a lot of company. There's plenty of people debating this in math and science who are just like, I don't know if that checks out. Questions though? I feel like the LSAT employs at least one far out like astrobiologist type, you know, who writes these kind of questions, you know. Some would be Neil deGrasse Tyson, or maybe it's him. You know, he's like, I could use the cash, right? Who's writing these kind of questions every now and then. They'll have things about exobiology and comets seeding life on other planets and stuff like that. So how do I predict an answer? Yeah, that's a tricky thing. It's harder to predict an answer. All we can know is that they're saying this, and so we need something that describes what this argument is. All right. I am super tempted to leave all my pretty stars up, but I guess I'll erase them. And let's see what we think of the answer choices. So we're gonna, since this is a little harder to predict exactly what they're gonna say, we're going to want to look for an answer that that is not good, maybe first. Maybe I want to start by knocking some things out and then making a second pass. And this is a really important habit to get into. So in terms of predicting in general, on an easier one, you might just say, oh, well, they reason from, they connect to conditional statements, or maybe they falsely reason from necessary to sufficient, or they conclude that because one outcome is more likely than the other, that it definitely happened, or something like that. Maybe we can predict exactly what they do. Here, since it's a little weird, we might have to do a little bit of elimination. Okay, so let's see what we think of an answer. I'll give you the poll again. All right, let's see what you got. If you haven't got an answer, give us your best shot. Pretty well divided. One answer that no one chose, and that one is C. Sorry if you were just about to click C. No one chose C. Notice they never said, this is way too broad, right? They never said dependable predictions cannot ever be made. On the contrary, they seem to be making it a prediction based on the present facts. They're saying, hey, I don't think this will ever happen based on the present facts. So they're not saying C. Any others that you feel confident getting rid of? A and E, B, B. Yeah, so E sounds really interesting. A lot of people, I think, liked E because it's making a prediction into the future, right? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with E? It seems like they're making a prediction about the future, right? Yeah, who was making a prediction based on established human tendencies? This is a specific kind of trap that they're giving us, right? Well, no, it's not no one. They specifically mentioned human tendencies in the argument. And if you missed it, that might be okay because it was the wrong place. Yeah, it's the some people, right? This is the argument of some people, but the author disagrees with them. Yeah, so it's going the wrong way, and that's not surprising on one of these. Even though it's not an ID the conclusion, they're still kind of talking about someone else's view. So that gets us rid of E. Some of you got rid of B. B is saying that it's contradictory. Now, we did say, hey, if this happened, then that would happen, and it didn't happen. But that's very different from saying implicitly contradicts one of the premises. That implies that the author is saying something impossible. That would be like if I said, hey, I don't know, let's say I start by saying that I've committed a crime and that I conclude that I must not have been alive at the time the crime was committed. Well, then how did I commit the crime, right? It doesn't make sense. So this is saying the author contradicts themselves. And the author may be weird, but the author does not contradict their own premise. See what I mean? They say, hey, if this were true, then this would happen, and I don't think it's true. But that's very different from saying, this is true, therefore this opposite thing is true, right? The earth is round, therefore it's flat, is kind of what B is accusing them of. So A and D are a really tempting pair, and I got several answers for each of those. It's not surprising. So both of these are talking about what's probably true, and that's really good caution on your part. If you chose A or D, this says has a low probability of occurring, and D is talking about probably false. Okay, and so they're both talking about what's probable, which is good because it says the odds are slim. It doesn't say I know what's up. And again, they're being cautious despite what someone might think is a sketchy or arrogant argument. But let's look at the difference between A and D. So in A, it says reasoning that because an event has not occurred, it has a low probability of occurring. What is the author saying? If we choose A, what is the event that they're saying has not occurred? How would you translate this? The colonization of space, right? So the translation, they're saying colonization of space has not happened, so it probably will not. So then let's look at D. D says inferring, and it's really important when they use abstract language like this. Again, we're going to have a very hard time predicting this exact answer. When they use abstract language like this, we need to fill it in. It reminds me a bit of the borrowed language we talked about in the first question. Inferring that since an event that is taken to be likely on a given hypothesis has not occurred, a hypothesis is probably false. Okay, breathe. That since an event that is taken to be likely on a given hypothesis has not occurred. So what's the hypothesis they're talking about? What hypothesis? If we grant D, what hypothesis would we mean? Yeah, the hypothesis is we will colonize space. And then what's the event that's going to be likely if that's the case? Yeah. What we're taking as likely is not just that there be more humans. Keep going more than that. What if we were going to colonize space? What is the thing that would be likely? Yeah. So most people alive then? And that would maybe be including us, right? Maybe we'd be alive then, right? It's kind of like when people say time travel isn't real because if it were, we'd have met time travelers. Maybe. That's an interesting argument, right? So they're saying, look, if it were true that we're going to colonize space, then you'd expect most people to be alive then. Since that hasn't happened, then we will probably not colonize space, right? So it's basically saying, translation, since if colonize, most of us alive then, and that didn't, and we're not, right? No colonization. A little harder to translate. Which makes A really tempting because it's right there at the beginning and it's simpler. But notice that A is simply taking out most of the complexity of the argument. And one way to guess that it's D, even though this is a dangerous game to play, but is D is confusing and difficult, just like the argument, right? A is just saying, hey, we haven't colonized space yet, so we won't, right? That would be like if I said, hey, jetpacks, no one has those yet, so we never will have them. Or, we haven't put humans on Mars, so we won't. The author is doing something much more involved than that. Can we agree on that? Even if we don't like what the author's doing, can we agree that it's got more parts to it than that? And that's a great way to get rid of A, even if we don't feel 100% about D. D is our answer because it's basically saying, yeah, we're saying that if we were going to colonize space, we'd see a bunch of people alive then. And if we saw a bunch of people alive then, we would probably be alive then. And we're not alive then, so it's not going to happen. And it's a really difficult thing to deal with because we might think this argument's crazy. When we see something like this, we can kind of conclude two different things. We might say this author's crazy, or we may say, hey, I'm just not smart enough, I don't get it. But I think, if you're feeling that way, be careful because the author might be crazy. The author might be a little out there. Right. So I hope you can understand what they're getting at, but in the end, you don't have to necessarily buy it. That's not our job. You don't have to say this makes sense. It's just what the authors say. Have I seen it often on the LSAT? Not much. I think they trotted this out to try it out on you. No, I don't think you're likely to see this much on the LSAT, but have I seen complicated arguments with lots of language you have to fill in that's abstract and you have to say, what do they mean by an event or a hypothesis? Yes, you're going to see that often, right? So will you see this particular argument about statistical methods of, if this happens and it's likely, then no, we're not going to see probably that again. Probably won't see that again. We could if this author is still employed at the LSAT and wants to play with it some more. But the more common thing that I do want you to get used to is you're going to see an argument that's kind of hard to describe. You're going to have to do some process of elimination to get rid of the answers that don't really fit what they're doing. And then you're going to have to watch the abstract language in the answer choices and match it up to things that they said in the argument. And that's really the way to get to D. One quick way to do it again is that B is contradictory, it's not contradictory. Right? C is absolute. You can't ever do something. They didn't say that. Most of these answer choices are too simple in that they're simply say the author did one thing. They made a prediction. They said because it hasn't happened, it won't. If we realize how involved the argument is, then we need an answer choice that matches that. It's like when you see a match the reasoning argument, the ones everyone's favorite, right? Where there's 6 arguments in one. They'll give you an argument and they'll say which of these answer choices looks like the argument, which has the same structure. Since Henrietta doesn't wish to join Club X, she will have to either join Club Y or Z. And if she doesn't, then this is going to happen and blah, blah, blah. And then they'll have a bunch of other arguments that look like that. And you're trying to match that same structure. And in those, you have to look at what kinds of arguments are they making. Oh, they gave Henrietta a choice, and they said if she doesn't do this choice, she'll have to do these other choices. And we want to see that structure in the answer choice, right? And so we have the same thing here. We have this very involved logical structure. We want to see a reflection of that complexity of the answer choice. And so one quick way, if you had to guess, is that D is one of the more complicated answers. That doesn't make it right in itself, but it's a good sign that it's more right than something like A. Okay, on that lovely note, I'm going to wrap us up. So let me know if you have questions on any of that. But I'm going to call it with that one. I hope this was a helpful delve into looking at how these arguments are put together, and this should help you on these question types in specific. But also hopefully when you do get to a question where the issue is simply, how do I strengthen or weaken, that you're better prepared to quickly and easily see the structure of the argument, so you can spend most of your time assessing the logic, which is what you'll often have to do. All right. Thanks very much. Best of luck to everybody. Hope all goes well.